Hello everyone, and welcome to our worship service on this 20th of February, or the 7th Sunday of Epiphany, the 7th Sunday after Epiphany. I think turn the other cheek must be in the top 10 of the most misunderstood teachings of Jesus. Love your enemies, turn the other cheek. It's not about putting up with a horrible situation, nor ignoring someone who continues to hurt you. Turn the other cheek isn't a passive stance at all. It turns out it's more a way of living and interacting with people that isn't so predictable. The principle of loving your enemies and turning the other cheek can help us in all our relationships. Our relationship with ourselves, people we have conflict with, and also people that we love. A reading from Luke chapter 6. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. And if anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. For you do good to those who do good to you. What credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, to receive as much again. But love your enemies, and do good, and lend. Expect nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be the children of the Most High, for He is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap, for the measure you give will be the measure you get back. So many sermons in that one passage, isn't there? So many teachings and so many things that, again, like last week, don't really make a lot of sense. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. If someone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other one. Give to everyone who begs from you. I mean, so many different things. Don't judge. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. So, continuing on in this Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew called it the Sermon on the Mount, Luke called it the Sermon on the Plain. And last week I mentioned that it isn't really one sermon. The Sermon on the Plain would actually have been many, many different teachings over a long period of time, because these teachings are unusual. They, upon first hearing, don't make any sense to us. And you'll notice just in that very short passage that I read, lots of questions arise when you hear a passage like that about loving enemies and giving to people that can't repay you. And judging is not allowed. And forgiveness has to be all the time. It's a necessity. It brings up so many questions, and there are so many problems. Like, it's almost like if Jesus was before us, we'd be saying, Jesus, this doesn't really make any sense to me at all. And I have found that when a teaching doesn't make sense, it's really a sign that there's more here than meets the eye. So you have a line that's just like a little nugget, so you have to end up unpacking it. It's like an onion. There is another layer, another layer, another layer. What is he saying? Love your enemies. So it really always calls for digging deeper, these texts. And what he does is, Jesus, is he gives us principles to live by. Once you learn the principle, then we have a chance of starting to practice it in our everyday life. He doesn't address every single thing that could happen to us in any relationship with any person. But what he does is that he gives a principle here that actually should be able to help us in every relationship, whether we say we have enemies or not. We might not have enemies. We might have people that are awkward, difficult, irritating. Or we might know someone that's going through a difficult time with someone who is what we would classify as a really difficult person, difficult personality to get on with. I think Jesus can give us a lot of wisdom when it comes to relationships with other people, relationships with ourselves, with relationships with people that we absolutely can't see eye to eye with at all. So in this passage we have one of the favorite verses actually, do unto others as you would have them do to you. Everyone seems to like that one. People don't have a problem with that, maybe because we think it's doable. That's in verse 31. So we don't have any trouble with that. But as soon as you drop down to verse 27, I've never heard anybody say this is their favorite scripture. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Never a favorite verse. Now again, you might not have enemies, but most of us have gone through or are presently going through relationships that are conflicted in some way. The principle in this verse or this passage will help us in all of our relationships, and I would extend that to even include the relationship we have with ourselves. So love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Seems impractical, almost dangerous, maybe a bit naive, certainly impossible to do. And I think, again, as I've mentioned many times, that the biblical understanding of love your enemies, is a very, very different word than what we normally think of. The word is agape, so it's agape your enemies, do good to those who hate you, and agape has absolutely nothing to do with approving of someone, liking someone, approving of their action. Agape love is more about what is in your best interest. If I give you agape love, I might not even like you, but I can still relate to you in such a way that I want what is in your best interest, what is best for you. So we're called to love one another. We're also called to love ourselves. So when we're in a relationship with someone or a group of people, what is the most loving thing for me to do for me? What is in my well-being? What is best for me? And also, I'm considering how I agape you. What is best for you? Yeah, it's funny because, you can have 50 nice people in your life and one awkward one, and it's the one awkward one that usually gets your attention. And that's where you learn more about yourself than when someone isn't pressing your buttons, right? It's usually when it's something's wrong that we learn something about ourselves. Now, in fairness to this text in Luke, the original audience of this teaching, love your enemies, actually had real enemies. As in, the Romans were the occupying force in the land, and they took advantage of the listeners. So that first audience The first listeners, Roman soldiers, actually stood on the corners of their towns. These people lived in an occupied land, so when Jesus spoke about enemies, they didn't have to think about an awkward relative or a son-in-law or a mother-in-law or a sibling that they really didn't like or somebody with a political difference in their family. No, they had real enemies. But the principles, again, will help us. Jesus didn't teach in a vacuum. He was always addressing issues that were before the people at that time, and they're the same things that trip us up today. How can you love someone who has harmed you or harmed someone you love? How can you love someone who broke a promise that just isn't trustworthy? And it's not trustworthy. How can you love that person? Well, you can if you define agape as want what's in your best interest. I want to love you in that way, and I also want to love myself. What is in my best interest? Then we'll decide how our future will look. So, that's one of the most helpful things I learned about that whole idea of loving people. Take the affection out of it, and it really starts to make a lot more sense that you don't have to approve, you don't have to like, you don't have to have any affection toward anyone. It's nothing about your personal feelings, and it starts to open up the teaching just a little bit more to make a little bit more sense. You never have to agree or approve of someone you don't like. So biblical love is an action. It's always a verb. It's always an action. It's not necessarily a feeling. So, love one another as I have loved you, Jesus said. This is one of the commandments of Jesus. Love one another as I have loved you. And it's certainly something that we have to learn. It is not something that comes naturally to us. I mean, our natural response to someone who hurts us might be to get as far away from them as possible. And that's not always possible, right? Or we might want to give back as good as we get, and we might want to be revengeful in some way, or hold a grudge. Maybe it's not as obvious as being revengeful. Maybe it's just a quiet grudge that stays there forever. Or we might gossip about someone that has hurt us. That might be a way of us sort of trying to get back at them. Jesus said, no, I have another way for you. These are all, you're just behaving like the one that's bothering you in the first place. I have another way for you, Jesus says. And he gives this example. He gives an example of this alternative way of living, which again, upon first reading, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. He says, if someone strikes you in the cheek, give them the other cheek. Turn the other cheek, he says. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, give them your left. Now, this is definitely one of these difficult verses that has been lost in translation. The first people would have understood exactly what he meant, because he's talking about a backhanded slap, basically. Hopefully that's not something that we have to endure in any way, shape, or form. But the first listeners would have understood exactly what he meant, because this is what the oppressive Romans, the ancient Romans, did to them all the time, if they wanted anything done. This is what oppressive ancient masters would do to ancient slaves. The backhanded slap is from a superior to an inferior. And usually, if you were hit in that way and you were the inferior, you would just sort of cower away, right? You would just be quiet and you would be scared, obviously, and you would just sort of be quiet and cower away. He says, oh, no. Don't want you to fight back. I don't want you to cower and hide. I want you to stand up and offer the other cheek. So, it turns out to be an act of resistance. It turns out to be, actually, it's an act of defiance. You would have to be pretty brave to do that. Turn the other cheek. Don't hit back and become like the one who's hitting you. And for the first listeners, if they had done that, they could die. So he's saying, don't hit back and become like the one who's hitting you. But don't back down and cower away either. Turn the other cheek. So what he's doing in the principle is that he's offering a way that we might not have thought of. We tend to think of a couple of things we can do. We tend to think either or. Well, either I can ignore this person or I can fight this person. No, he's saying, be more creative than that. Is there another way? Is there another way to deal with this person that you haven't considered? Because you've been so locked up in, well, I'll either do this or I'll do this. Maybe there's something else. Maybe there's something entirely creative that you've never ever considered. You know, we get stuck into binary thinking, don't we? Either or, black or white. I think what he's pointing at here is that he's saying, I'm going to give you another way to live. It's God's way. I'm going to give you another option. And it's an option that you probably have not considered. So he offers a creative option. We tend to think about two choices. How am I going to deal with Harry this time around? He's driving me crazy. Okay? He's offering a whole other way. What did you do in the past? Well, I've tried everything. I fight or flight. I either take him on or I just ignore him, and neither way works. Okay. Does God have another way here? Is there another option that you've never considered because you're so locked into the way you normally do things? And we're all like this, aren't we? We all get stuck in responding the same way all the time. Somebody says something, it presses our buttons, it gets us annoyed. We respond the same way. We're very reactionary in however we prefer to react. Whether we withdraw or whether we're aggressive, doesn't really matter. We tend to get locked into particular ways of responding to people. Now, that pattern is not always helpful. Obviously, it's helpful enough because it's, got us through life to a certain extent, but it's very, very limiting. And Jesus is pointing to another way of living and being. Not just, business as usual. Not just she always makes me lose my temper. I get so furious, I get so annoyed. Well, okay, wait. Pause. What if there was another way? Or, well, I don't really get annoyed. I just don't want anything to do with it. And I just want to go away and I don't want to talk about it. Just leave me alone. Okay, that's your normal way. But in this situation, can you stop and can you consider another way? You see, Jesus never ever spells out what to do in particular situations. I really don't know how to deal with my mother-in-law. She does this, she does that. I don't know what to do about my father-in-law. I mean, he's just a very difficult character. I'm exhausted. He's never going to address that. But what he will do is he will always address or teach these timeless principles. And then it's our spiritual work, it's our emotional work to take these spiritual principles and then start to apply them to the particular areas that we're struggling with in our life. Yeah, it's like turn the other cheek. It's another way of saying, sometimes your usual way of dealing with conflict and trouble isn't really the best way. And whatever way that would be, can you start to think outside the box and maybe do something that you normally wouldn't do? Now, maybe it's going to be a lot harder, because if you have a response of fighting back or a response of getting as far away as possible, it's not going to be easy to start to consider doing things or saying things that you normally wouldn't say, is it? That's going to take a bit of stretching. That's going to take a bit of emotional growth to do that. But I think that is one of the keys that Jesus is pointing out here. Notice what you normally do when you're in conflict. Pay attention to it, notice it, because that cycle, whatever you do, that same thing, that repetitive thing that you do, may not be serving you well at all. Yeah, it's always about going against the usual pattern. It's always about going, or questioning, not always about going against our usual pattern, because sometimes we do respond correctly. I think if we get stuck in something and we keep on repeating the same mistakes and the same arguments and we go round and round in circles, that would be a time to say, something's not working here. I keep doing the same thing over and over again, and I keep getting the same response, which isn't good, and it's not helping me. God, I think I need another way. See, the challenge is always to not get caught up in either or. Either I can do this or I can do this. God's very, very creative. God's very creative and can give us other ways of thinking about ourselves, and other ways of thinking about situations, and other ways of thinking about people. So the path of change, or the spiritual growth, always happens, or seems to always happen, during times of tension like that, where there's a choice. Now, how am I going to respond to this? Will I do things as usual, which don't really work out for me, or am I going to be willing to do something else? If I'm assertive and forceful, I've already found out that doesn't always work well for me or for the other people in my life. If I'm too quiet and withdrawing, I already know this doesn't serve me and the other people in my life well. We already know these things because we've tried them out. So the spiritual growth for us would be, am I open to a new way of living and being and responding that isn't my usual way? And will I try that? Yeah, we all have different ways of dealing with conflict. But I think in order to grow spiritually, in order to grow emotionally, we have to be willing to try another way, to not just get locked into the same way all the time, but to sort of broaden up our tools and our emotional tools so that we can tackle things from a variety of different responses. When to go forward, when to pull back, when to say nothing, when to stand up, when to withdraw, all these things. It takes a lot of wisdom, doesn't it? It takes wisdom to learn, what we can change, what we can't change. It takes wisdom to stop and reflect before acting, before speaking, before responding. Wisdom is about considering a third choice. Now, I'm not just saying third as in there's only 3 choices. I think there's many, many choices. But I think that what Jesus continually points out is that he brings up another area or another angle to something that most people miss. So, I mean, he took the example of turning the other cheek, which would have made perfect sense to these people in that culture. It's like, oh, wow, I never even thought about doing that. I thought I only could do 2 things. I thought I could only stand and take it, or I could cower away and just say yes, sir, and no, you know. It never occurred to me that I could resist in that way. So it would have been like this new thought that opened up whole new possibilities. And that seems to be the way that God works with us when we have an openness. Whether we're dealing with the relationship with ourselves, or relationship with somebody who's difficult, or just our relationships in general. Because sometimes we have trouble with people that we actually do like, right? And God can help us in all of these ways. You know, the Sermon on the Plain, the Sermon on the Mount, most of it's about relationships. It was a key teaching for Jesus. How to go on with ourselves and how to go on to other people, with other people. So there's the prayer. There's the heart cry. God, help us to be open, to think about ourselves and other people and our relationships in new ways. Give us awareness when we're just reacting and doing things we normally do, because that's what we do. Give us some awareness so that we can be set free. Remember that wonderful promise? If the Son sets you free, you shall be free indeed. Amen.